come in out of Los Angeles every Saturday morning, and we do this 104 times. Why do we do this? Because this pattern, this steady pattern, is like an oil rig that finally bores down to the black gold. We finally get to where we need to get to. Why do we need to get there? Because it's there. It's not there as a challenge. What's there is not there as a challenge. It's not like the glib reply of Sir Edmund Hillary that he climbed Everest because it was there. We get there because we have no choice in the matter, because the there-ness is ourselves. And just being alive brings who we really are into play. And because this is a highly imperfect world, which you have all realized in the last week or sometime in your life, bringing our real selves into play with this world, this imperfect world, brings what politely are called discontinuities into play. Problems, disgusting situations, stupidity. And the urge, the only urge that compensates that, is to do something about it. Otherwise, you fall into a victimization syndrome, and people will use you as a, what was the phrase in Ghostbusters? I feel like the doormat of a taxi cab. You don't have to be the doormat of a taxi cab. But in order to do something about it, you can't just react to this, that, the other, because it's always going on. So to do something about it in some realistic way takes a method and takes a pattern. The problem is that all the methods and all the patterns have loopholes in them that make them even more insidious. The problems of daily life are exacerbating, or occasionally capable of bringing out great anger. But the pattern of our involvement with these problems is actually perilous. So this education addresses itself continuously to maintaining that kind of investigative continuity that finally yields the results, the contact, the black gold within us. We strike that fuel that makes the whole system go. Now that fuel, in a way, is psychic energy. Psychic energy. And psychic energy has a very peculiar quality. In traditional culture, psychic energy is equated with blood. We can say that we know that blood is a plasma, has certain constituents, certain qualities, even a very specific pH value. But we know now that blood is not the arbiter in the body. The blood in the body is indexed by a different fluid, by a whole different system. the neural fluid for the brain and the cortical extension of the spinal column are a distillation of blood plasma. Very refined. If one looks at cerebral neural fluid, one can not tell the difference immediately between it and water because it's 99% water. But the differences are extraordinary because they make it possible for a nervous system to function within a blood system without confusion. Because blood and neural fluid do not mix. They have what is called the blood-brain barrier. They don't mix. And because they don't mix, they work together through a membrane interface. And that membrane is not just some kind of a wall, but it's an osmotic transmission, liminal quality. And it allows for the penetration from the neural system into the blood, but not the other way. So if the neural system controls the body, and the body does not control the neural system. So if the neural system indexes the body, it gives it a higher order. And so we need to get into the neural system and not just the blood system in order to affect real change, get real solutions to real problems. Now, on an educational level, in terms of what we're dealing with here in this education, the only way to get to that neural fluid level is through a transformation. Because the neural fluid level already exists only because of a distillation process. And distillation is a chemical form of transformation. I mean, the difference between rice juice and sake is distillation. You're not going to get excited about heating up rice juice. But at 110.7 degrees, sake helps a lot of problems. But you can't have that unless you go through a distillation process. The same thing with an education. An education must have in it a distillation process which is effective across the board so that you are changed, so that you could get to the indexing order and make those changes which are not possible on the body level. And yet, one can never throw the body away because the body is the only vehicle that can make those changes. And so you have to preserve the body at the same time as getting to the neural system in such a way that both of them will work together. Now, this can be stated with another kind of language, with other terms, so that it's easier to understand. One will have to go through the 979 pages of the standard textbooks on neural medicine in order to get a real complete scientific understanding of what this would be. But we can say it in other terms. And the other terms run something like this. If I take this tablet, these pages on it, everyone can see that this is just a writing, plain old writing tablet. There's nothing written. This is the archetypal form in the Western tradition of the indexing medium of ourselves. It's called in Latin a tabula rasa. It means a blank page, a white page, blank page. And in the Western tradition, all of our cultures were developed on the Roman idea, the Roman Latin language idea of a blank page, a tabula rasa. A baby is a blank page upon which we write the values that we want it to have. We train it to eat the kinds of food we want, to have the kinds of properties, and so forth. This is a pernicious and insidious flaw. This is an error. And it crept into Western society with the Roman Empire. And it became codified in Western society with a thinker named St. Augustine. St. Augustine. And the outcome of submitting to this kind of psychological understanding was 1,000 years, a millennium of medieval ruts. The initial hundreds of years were in fact so bad they were called, and they're still called, the Dark Ages. And it's very simple to demonstrate the flaw. Even though this is a blank page, watch what happens. Even though the page is blank, it takes a fold. It begins to have structure. Nothing is written on it. It's still a blank page, but it begins to have structure. And you can continue to do this. And you can build up quite a structure without having anything on the page. It's still a tabula rasa. It's still a blank page. But the flaw is that the Roman mind emphasized the blankness of the page rather than the pageness. It's the pageness that is important to existence. And all of the fundamental flaws in the Western world view can be traced to this particular burr. This is the boil on our butt that keeps us from sitting in the saddle of existence in a comfortable way. It's Hollywood style. We don't have to have it. It's not necessary. There have been many people, many kinds of human beings who have not had this flaw. It's the blankness of the page that is the flaw. It's the pageness of the blank page that is the cue. Now, the folding of that page, that level of activity, is what ritual is. And in life, that's the level of instinct. Birds build nests. Foxes live in holes in the ground and are very stealthy. Rhinos huff and puff and go after people in films by snorting and all kinds of things. All by instinct. All by folds on the page of their existence. So that while existence is really a blank page, indeed it is, it's the pageness which is real, which is extant. Now, for us, we add something to that. On those folds of that blank page, we put words. We say words. So that if I take another sheet of paper and I fold it, and I make sure that I fold it exactly halfway, you are folded halfway. You are now not only just a structure, but you're a balanced structure. And I'm going to fold the half, an exact half, and I'm going to make a quaternary. And this quaternary is going to have a lot more firmness and capacity, which just the half had. And I'm going to fold that again so that I have an 8-fold Pageness. Now at this level of complexity, all we've done is make 3 folds. 1, 2, 3. Once you have 3 folds, you can carry this on indefinitely, so that the phrase that one of the most charming of all the physicists, George Gamow, used a phrase for a title of one of his great books called 1, 2, 3, infinity. 1, 2, 3, ellipsis, infinity. When I met George Gamow about 35 years ago, he was driving a red Porsche convertible up in the Sierra Nevada with his blonde companion and his matching leather suitcases, and he wasn't thinking about infinity at all. And in his plump, jovial excellence, he looked like he was a great companion. 1, 2, 3, infinity. Once you get 3 folds, once you have 3 folds on your Pageness, you have a noble 8-fold path. Because you have a double quaternary. You have 2 4s. The cubing of a pair is enough complexity to an instinctual wholeness to give it the capacity to now take words and arrange those words into an even deeper quality called a symbol. Now our Pageness has leapt 2 orders of complexity. Instinct has gone 2 orders beyond what it just is in the animal kingdom, or the bird kingdom, or the plant kingdom. Yeah, plants have instinct too. I love the sun, they'll turn towards the sun. What is instinct on the ritual level in existence deepens with language. By putting words on the folds, instinct deepens into custom. I'm using the term in the way in which early 20th century anthropology would use the term, like Bronislaw Malinowski and so forth. Custom. One of Malinowski's famous books is Crime and Custom in Savage Society. Custom. Custom is the myth level. So that instinct, with words, put on the folds. And the folds are our action, what we do. And when we put words on what we do, morning coffee. Now I'm ready to work. They don't have to be highly charged words, but notice there is a charged quality that comes out anyway. And so myth deepens ritual. Words fortify. Custom deepens instinct. And when it deepens, it has a kind of a momentum. And its momentum is to go even deeper. And on the deeper level, custom becomes patterned. And a pattern custom is what tradition is. Tradition. That's a level of symbol. It's not the blankness of the page that's important that supports this, but the pageness. If you put the emphasis on the blankness of the page and you start to try to fantasize about the blankness, you abstract it prematurely, what you're working with is fantasization. Now, there's all the difference in the world between fantasy, which is creative imagination, which is very, very interesting. It's a form of play. There's nothing wrong with fantasy. But fantasization is forced fantasy. It's premature fantasy. And fantasization, when it comes to the symbolic level, becomes, well, I have to use a term that all of you probably like, but I have to use it derisively, that is in a negative mode. So just imagine little quotation marks around the word. Metaphysics. Fantasization systematized as metaphysics. Madame Blavatsky used to call it metaphysling. And she was very guilty of it herself. But when she was not, on her high horse, when she was rolling her own cigarettes, she was pretty smart lady. Metaphysling. Metaphysling, when it is integrated, leads to a neurotic quality that has nothing to do with life, with nature, with instinct. It has everything to do with versions of myths and systemizations of those into worldviews that have nothing to do with anything real, but have everything to do with your fantasized projection. And there's no limit to how many people can agree to that kind of metaphysics. In Nazi Germany, some 45 million people subscribed to an absolutely ridiculous worldview. I had a friend one time that did the horoscopes of the top 230 figures in Nazi Germany. And it looked like a nightmare who's who, astrologically. I mean, you could see it. They were all flawed in very similar ways. The price to pay for some kind of technological Third Reich is too high. We're not going to pay it because we're not going to allow that situation to develop in the first place because it's totally unnecessary. And one of the functions of an education of a free people is to make sure that there are at least some men and women functioning who are not susceptible to those kinds of fantasized metaphysics. You don't have to have everybody. The brain is only 2% of the body. But there have to be enough to make things work. So this education goes back and replays through the way in which nature, instinct, custom, and tradition integrate and form an ecology, a whole. And one of the principles is that if you enrich that integration process, if you put a lot into it, if you enrich it, and not just enrich it by content, but enrich it by an awareness of the processes also, integration, when it does its thing, And what is its thing? What is integration's thing? Integration is like breathing in. Well, what are you going to do? You know what you have to do? Differentiation is the natural complement to integration. It is a universal principle. Just as you have integral equations in calculus, you have to have differential equations in calculus. And the differential qualities are not going to be anything different from the integral qualities, just in a different mode. Then one of the simplest ways of saying this, I heard this from the first American bhikkhu. He was a cousin of Barry Goldwater's, and he learned it in China in the 1920s. He went to China to study under one of the great Buddhist masters in China. When he got to Shanghai in the early 1920s, the scruffy old Chinese guy with a pea coat and a scrunched down hat and runny nose met him, and he, coming from the Goldwater riches, said, "Well, can you take me to the master?" And man nodded his head, and it wasn't until about a week later they found out this was the master. He had a cold, and that's the only kind of clothes they had in Shanghai in the 1920s, and he completely missed it. And the old man taught him well enough that he could succinctly say, it's like following a recipe. If you want to have chocolate cake, put the ingredients of chocolate cake into the recipe. Don't throw twigs and dirt and water in there and expect to get chocolate cake. You're going to get a mud pie. That's a little twiggy. You cannot get out something different from what you put in. It's a universal principle. So all the care needs to go in integration, in putting together. Because the differentiation process, which our whole second year is about the differentiation, what comes out of the oven. What comes out of the oven of the mind can be consciousness and not some kind of metaphysic fantasization. It can be conscious. A responsible education that's really of service to its people sees to it that all of this activity is tended to with conscientiousness. And if it is, you will be able to experience this for yourself. No one will have to prove it to you. You'll see it for yourself. But not in some kind of leap of faith, intuition, but you'll be able to follow it actually as it is engendered and happens. And then whatever uses you have for it are your uses. They're your uses. The folded page. It's the pageness. And the name of the lecture today is Pageness. It's not the blankness, but the pageness. In this whole process, there is a coordination. There's a coordination between the hand and the brain. The hand and the brain. And that coordination has a fulcrum that it balances on, and that fulcrum is language. A mode of language that we use a kind of a common English designation that holds all the way down is called speech. Speech. So that when you truncate, when you condense, when you put together hand and brain, what the hand does are gestures, what the brain does works with speech. so you can bring it together and call it gesture and speech. And in fact, one of the most beautiful volumes called Gesture and Speech, André Leroy-Gourhan, who was an investigator of Paleolithic art. He spent his whole life looking at cave art, mostly in France and northern Spain. And the cover of his great book, Treasures of Prehistoric Art, he spent his whole life on that. And in gesture and speech, he has very, very interesting diagrams, and on page 39 are diagrams of the way in which the hand and the brain of early primates and man differ. And one of the ways in which man is an evolutionary improvement is that his hand and his brain coordinate on a more refined level. Why? Because their coordination is a distilled, paired symbiosis. On the level of Homo sapiens, our species, and the sapiens is repeated twice, by the way. We're not just wisdom man, but we're wisdom man. Why is it repeated twice? Because there's a fold in the page of wisdom. Because in the name of our species, there are actually 3 words. Homo, man, which is already a fold in the page. Sapiens, which is the 2nd fold in the page. And another sapiens, which is the 3rd fold in the page. And our species works on this universal principle. If you would see someone of our species that's like this 8-fold blank page, what you would see is something like a Zen master. Doesn't have to have any content whatsoever. Doesn't have to have any symbol system operating whatsoever. Just is. So our whole species is an improvement of the way in which the hand and the brain are not only coordinated, they're already coordinated on very early primate levels. Even before the kind of apes and monkeys that we are, the little shrews that ran around in Jurassic Park times, which is actually Cretaceous times, to give it a more correct scientific designation. Cretaceous Park would have been a better title. Forget it. Still Hollywood. Even the little shrews that ran around already had hand and brain that worked together closer than just mere coordination. As soon as speech comes into play, the coordination becomes cinched together in such a way that they're not just mechanically juxtaposed, but that they are organically woven. Speech weaves gesture into patterns. Speech weaves gesture into patterns, so that when someone is conscious of this, you choose language specially so that those words can be woven together. We talked a couple of weeks ago about the young Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, when he was 19, 18 years old at Harvard, making his own translations of Aeschylus from the Greek. How those manuscripts are here in Los Angeles at the Huntington library out in San Marino. And he read in Aeschylus that Aeschylus said that his tragedies were just slices of life from the feast of Homer. So Thoreau right away, wanting to go to the big guy, right, went to Homer and realized that here was something so vast. And he patterned his whole style of American English on the Homeric ideal of woven words. Woven words. And because in Homer, already 3,000 years ago, he was conscious of the effect of such a woven language, he called them winged words. His phrase in Greek translates literally as winged words. That when somebody is conscious, the way they speak is in winged words. Meaning that these words not only come together and weave hand and brain together into a woven structure, but that structure then has an effective differential utility. It can fly, and that's what vision is all about. Vision is the kind of life that differentially flies out of that integral nest that's made by those woven words. We've mentioned it twice before, maybe twice more. Jacob Bronowski, in his Ascent of Man, a book in a 13-part video series done about 30 years ago, one of his favorite phrases was, "The hand is the cutting edge of the mind." And that our species really understands best when our hands can do it. When our hands can do it, we really get it then. Whereas when we put the cart before the horse, when we try to understand before we can do it, we get on wobbly ground. We're very susceptible to fantasization. We're very susceptible to metaphysling. But when you talk to men and women whose hands are a good foundation of what they know, those people are hard to deceive. They're very hard to deceive. And this is why, on the custom level, peasants are very superstitious about people that don't share their work with them. The people that work together, their understanding of the world holds together because it's very real. And so what is really a very positive outlook also has its negative limiting restrictions, because peasants don't like change. This is the way we do it. Our people do it this way. In Chechnya, we're not Moscowites. We don't do it that way. Those guys are Russians. It's on that level that custom becomes exclusive of other customs. And when it's cinched together into traditions, traditions do not mix together. They do not mix together. You can't legislate them into mixing together. You cannot force them into mixing together. I on purpose keep forgetting the Nazi word for all the cultures being dissolved and mulched together into the Third Reich. It meant conformity in English. Everybody's going to conform. There's only going to be one culture, and that's the Nuremberg scene. It does not work. It does not work not because somebody doesn't put enough power into it, enough tanks, enough nuclear bombs. It doesn't work because of that. It doesn't work because structurally it cannot work. And as soon as you can show, and you can show it graphically, people will stop trying to do things that way. You cannot force people together. People who already have their customs, who already have their traditions, cannot be forced together. The best form of that is called, it's called this all over the world, Los Angelesization. The only way that they can be brought together is through common experience, through a common language, and through a common transformation. And when that happens, cultures transform into a civilization. And a civilization, rather than obliterating cultures, allows for many different cultures to work together in such a way that you have a higher order of human life. And that higher order of human life is not dependent upon scrapping the values of various peoples. It has absolutely nothing to do with that. That would be a metaphysical system. Civilization is totally different. It is conscious, transformed, indexing level. And it works just like the blood system and the neural fluid system would work together. Though they're incommensurate, they do not mix. They, in fact, have a membrane barrier between them, not just a single one. There are many facets to it. If one could crystallize it, it would look like a jewel. Interesting. But the nervous system and the blood system, when they work together, you have a higher form of life. And that higher form of life has such a deep root in life that already, when does the first spinal column come into play? When the very first vertebrates are made. Fishes. Prehistoric fishes. And the whole function of a spinal column is a brain which is mobile, like a fish needing to be mobile to swim. So that literally the brain and its spinal column come into evolution to allow for a superior mobility. Not to make people freeze-dried in some Nazi metaphysics, but to allow for life to be supple so that it has a mobility that exceeds the previous mobility. This education is worked on for many decades so that this process of unfoldment happens, so that not only are we able to fold our pageness in a way that is apparent to us and now very useful. Now we can choose to put the speech that we want on the folds that we want and get the symbols that we really would like to live by. But it allows us also, and that's what the second year is, to open up that page and see what we got. We got those ingredients, we made that recipe, we put it in the oven. Let's bring it out and eat it. Let's enjoy it. Let's have that. And that's what this is all about. And the first unfoldment of this is vision. The second unfoldment of this is art. And the third unfoldment of this is history. And then what you have is the cosmos. Now it's a very interesting thing. The difference between nature and cosmos is that one has the folds on the page. In nature, one simply has the page. But in a cosmos, one has the patterned folds so that one can see. This patterned page very easily factors back into nature without leaving a trace. As the Taoist tradition says, if the energy cycle flows purely, the 10,000 things go back into Tao, and there's only Tao. There's nothing left over. And it can go again all the way and come back. This is the alternation between 0 and 1. And with this simple binary code, one can express any process into infinite detail, so that to a median level of life like our own, it looks like reality, functions like reality is reality. Whereas if one became super yogi and ground down to the nth degree, one could see it dissolve, just like one could look at the atomic structure of gold and watch it dissolve. One can take a gas like helium, and you can condense it down, and you can make it into a liquid. It's very certain, very deep, cold temperature. Liquid helium behaves in such ways that gravity no longer works. Liquid helium crawls out of the beaker in which it's held. Why? Because the reality of whatever it is that we are, wherever it is that we are in, has mysterious qualities that happen at the very ends and extremes and at the very middle of its process. Now, in an individual life, it's very, very difficult to go to the extremes, to go to the 0 or the infinity. But it's very natural for us to be able to get to the center. And at the center, all the qualities at 0 and infinity also come into play. That middle point, that's the soul. That's the deep self. That's the mind. And though it isn't anything in itself, it is in fact the ultimate folding of our pageness. And at that point of no dimension, both integration and differentiation have an equanimity. So exactly even that they function for any purpose as a continuity. And so the best that one can say is that consciousness is a self-reflective certainty of that functioning equanimity. And wherever consciousness is really itself, it has that particular characteristic resonance. It's like a taste. It's the taste of fresh water or clear air. Its taste is that it doesn't have any other taste. It doesn't have any particular taste. Fresh water is only water. Clear air is just air. The proof is that it does not have any other taste, does not have any other smell. And so one of the great metaphors for it is simply white light. Simply white light. If you put a prism into white light, it will diffract the entire spectrum. The whole rainbow is there. But when it's together, instead of all the colors of the spectrum, which if you took all the colors of the spectrum and you mixed them, you know what you get? Gray. All metaphysical systems are shades of gray. None of them are pure. Whereas the real is pure, so much so that you can diffract the entire range of reality out of its purity. So one of the great metaphors for wisdom has always been the rainbow. In Genesis, When Moses is writing down Genesis about 1200 BC, even before it was edited by Jeremiah's father Hilkiah some 500 years later, when Moses was looking for a symbol for the covenant between God and Abraham, he used the rainbow because it was the effective way in which that natural valuation comes into its real integration. In English translation, he says, to demonstrate that this covenant is real, I set my bow in the sky. Set my rainbow in the sky. It's that kind of equality. The mystical aspect that's there, not drawn out for another 1,000 years. The first people to ever draw it out were the Hellenistic Jews in Alexandria 1,000 years later. Every drop of rain in a rainbow is itself a rainbow. In nuclear physics today, we know this is the principle of the soliton. The principle of the soliton is that when you have an energy integration, in whatever shape it is, every resonance of that will be a completeness. Every soliton vibration of sound is the entire cup. That's how you know that it's real. And this is how astronomy works. Astrophysics works. Telescopes collect light. What is the light? The light are the photons from celestial bodies, from stars. We have the capacity with digital computers and the Hubble telescope to hone down to a single photon, a single particle of light from one star. When you take that single photon and you put it on a spectrograph, you get the whole readout of the entire star. You know that such a star is helium depleted because there's an absorption line here. We know that the star is very old because there are iron emission lines already, and that's the heaviest element that's synthesized in a star before it goes nova. So when you see the depletion of helium and the registering of iron in a single photon from a star, you know it's a very old star. Why? Principle of the soliton. Every particle of light from a star carries the entire star. And just the same way, when a human being is really there, they are the entire universe. The whole spectrograph of what is real is there in you. You don't have to queue up to some goddamn weekend guru or some metaphysling system. Those are extraneous, to use the mathematical term. When there are enough men and women to make a society that has a civilization like that, all the animals will be animals, all the birds will be birds, and all the children will be children. Let's take a break. What are we saying? That our education now, this first quarter of the second year, is called vision, and that vision is a resonance of realization. Just like a bell that you strike, the resonances. But the resonances do not have content. They have form, but not content. The resonances are like the folds on the page. So that there's a structure to consciousness, but the structure is not any particular content whatsoever. It's like an optical illusion. As long as you're looking at the content, you're not seeing the structure. And in fact, there's a classic distinction that's made in language, and the distinction is between form and content. Between form and content. And that consciousness has a formal structure, but it's only evident when there's a content that fills or expresses, as we would say, that structure. The human personality, the structure of the human personality, is the constants of the folds of integration. To just say it simply, the human personality is a prism. It has a structure, it has a formal structure, but it doesn't necessarily have any content, but it accepts any content. But whatever the content is, it plays out then that particular spectrum. And there are amazing, endless variety of people. So that there's no standard person. There is also no ideal person in terms of content. Whatever ideality there might be is a formal, structural consideration that is completely transcendent to content. So in a very real way, the trepidation of playing follow the leader is a false fear. As long as people do not get caught up into crossing their eyes, looking at their own nose, looking at their own projection, living in a cross-eyed illusion. And part of the difficulty in the differential process is to help those who have gone through an integration transformation uncross their eyes. Because everyone naturally comes out with crossed eyes. Why is this so? Because interior meaning arrays itself increasingly into integration so that the inner looking is with a single eye. That's why it's called the eye of vision or the eye of realization. Singular. In order for the two eyes to see something in depth, much less in color, they have to focus, they have to coordinate. They make a focus. And the factual, perceptual extent of the focus is just a single point. Maybe you've been to an eyeglass exam recently where they have this kind of opaque, milky screen and have these little tiny infinitesimal points of light. And you're to click every time one of those appears. And the pattern of those disclose the pattern of your vision, what you're able to see. So you can get an eyeglass prescription that's accurate for you. It's only the rapid movement of that point of focus that gives enough pixels to give enough visual perceptual information to cue in a gestalt, which then you recognize as a picture. And this process is even there in dreaming. What is dreaming? The REM, rapid eye movement state. But the deeper you go into integration, the deeper you go into looking with the mind, the less movement there is, and the more that single pointedness occurs. In fact, in standard ancient traditional Buddhist meditation, the Sanskrit name of that single point was called ekagrata, single pointedness. Ekagrata. And it was no big thing. It was just simply learning how to focus your eyes within. The inner eyes sees singularity. So that when you come out of integration, when you come out of that transformation, when you look at the world, your first, number one, very first gesture is to look at it cross-eyed. Some of the old antiquarian illustrations of meditation show the yogis with the cross eyes. If you could freeze a snapshot of a Mevlevi dervish, his eyes are crossed. Because when one looks within, one looks to that oneness within. Inner vision is singular. And so part of the problem in consciousness, part of its problem, is learning to renormalize oneness of vision back into the filigree of the detail of the world. And that's just as difficult to do as it was to integrate it into unity. It's just the other side of that process, equally a problem. And it's not a problem just for super yogis who've reached one-pointedness of mind. It is a standard problem of all conscious entities, no matter who, no matter what species that would be conscious. And so a conscientious education has to take that into consideration. There's a real problem requiring, again, a whole methodological approach. And so it takes a whole year to open that out and redo that. The glib habit of faulty language gets in our way all the time then. It always gets in our way. We stumble over habitual words and habitual phrases that have not been transformed. They've not been adjusted to a differential process. They're still used in the integral way. And it's compounded because that integral way was already flawed by premature abstractions enforced through faulty education. Our junkyard of a society is a direct result of forcing school children to live in abstract worlds before they're ready to. And the fact that the abstract world is illogical, the one that's presented, just makes it even more complex. How do people get through it? Largely by ignoring it. The de facto choice of coping is to forget it. And to the extent that you can forget it, you can operate as a human being, more or less. But that tack is useless to change the situation, much less to transform the conditions that control the situation, much less educate the human beings who manufacture and make those conditions which control those situations. So it's compounded many times over. And by trying to address it with force or majority vote is the same kind of ineffectuality. It's like a watch that's broken. You can't fix it by smashing it, and you can't fix it by jiggling it, and you can't fix it by saying, work. You have to have somebody who can go in there and open it up and see why it isn't working and fix that. It takes the right kind of techniques. It takes the right kind of tools. And frankly, the tools that were necessary to readjust the last time they were made in the West was 300 years ago. The last person to make those kinds of tools was John Amos Comenius. The tool that he made to work on the broken watch of the human personality was the picture textbook. Not the slovenly fourth-hand, eighth-rate textbooks that pass now state curriculum committees because they're slipped all kinds of commissions. I once, when I was a young professor, had the disagreeable experience of lecturing to the senior board of Harcourt Brace Jovanovich editors that were doing a textbook that eventually became used not only in the state of California but in 30 some odd states. The contract was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. These were the senior editors. I talked to them about integration. They gave me a fat honorarium and they ignored it because it meant a lot of work and it meant scrapping what they had done and go back and start all over again. No way. We have a product that we know we're going to sell. We got the contract. Fortunately, I was already 27 years old, and because when I was 17, I would have said, we need a revolution. But by 27, I thought deeper, and I knew we need an education. But the more you go into those practical problems, the more you can see the tools aren't even made to work at this problem. It takes a long time to make those tools. Long time. First, you have to figure out what tools do you need? What's broke? How does it work when it's whole? So it's not just a broken watch. It's sort of like an old Inuit fisherman who's given a Macintosh that doesn't work. There are lots of jumps of capacity that are needed before you can get to it. Yeah, you can plug it in, but that's about it. And initially, that's all that could be done. Plug in the education, and you could see it didn't work. Not that something didn't happen, but that what happened was irrelevant to a human being being conscious about their reality and being able to live a life that they want to live by truths that they hold and they understand, by values that they're willing to work for. And those are not pie-in-the-sky ideals. Those are just fundamentals that a spiritual being has the right to. Those are what Jefferson called inalienable rights. They are God-given. They're not fantasizations by peculiar oddballs who are hermits of the species. They're fundamental structures of how this life form operates. They're inalienable rights. So it's taken a long time. One of the flaws we've talked about is prematurely focusing on the blankness of the blank page rather than the pageness. How does that happen? How did it happen historically? How did, I have to use a Hollywood phrase, how did the goddamn blocky Roman mind make such a flaw in the first place? How did that happen? How come in the 400s AD you can see it not only written out large, but cinched and made into doctrine? Not just church doctrine, but empire doctrine. All the school systems were made that way. How did that happen? Without going into it for a whole generation, one of the focuses is on the fact that the Romans spoke Latin and not Greek, and that the civilization that they took over was a Greek language civilization. And that Greek language civilization was based upon a transformation of an Egyptian civilization that existed before it. So when one is going to be a doctor of civilization, one is faced with an incredible array of problems. Well, what was the Egyptian civilization? Well, what was the Greek civilization? And what was the transformation of that? And then what was the Roman misunderstanding? It's endless. Very few people have even had the stupid guts to address that problem. But to save you 20 years or more, in the Greek language, when one wants to say something profound about reality and about ourselves, one of the most telling phrases in Greek is peri ton on ton. What does that mean? It means concerning beings. On what are beings? And that phrase occurs most pristinely around 90 AD in Alexandria, in the very first of what is a series of treatises that have historically been known since the Renaissance as the Hermetic treatises. And the first of those treatises in Greek is called Poimandres. The poi is not like Hawaiian poi. It's not a Polynesian succotash. Poi is Greek root for words like poetry, poiesis, making. Poimandres, it means a mind shepherd, but it means dynamically mind shepherd. That a mind shepherd is not a thing, it's not a cardboard cutout, but a mind shepherd is a dynamic working artist. It's the difference between a designer and Picasso. What's the difference between designer and Picasso? Picasso is seated at his villa in his late 80s, and he's having fish with his girlfriends and wives, and he picks up the fish and voraciously, because Pablo was voracious, nibbles away all the meat and then looks at the bone structure of the fish. And right away, he's got the ceramics out. He's making some kind of cubist fish skeleton on some kind of ceramic matrix. And before the afternoon is out, he's done 5,000 variations, because Picasso just... That's Picasso. What is a designer? A designer looks in through the window to see what he made and then makes t-shirts out of that. That's how the word shit got into the Hollywood language. They're also called critics. What is all this about? It's that the Greek words have a dynamic quality to them which the Latin language doesn't have. The Greek language is like vibrant blood flowing, and the Latin language is like the skeleton. This bone goes here, that bone connects to that bone, and you've heard that song. That's a Roman song. The Romans, the Latin language likes to get the joints into the right receptors, and once that's done, then they say, well, now, that skeleton is a man. And since all men have this kind of skeleton, let's make Roman laws on a fundamental basis that you got to have your arms in the right place, you got to have your legs in the right place. If you have this kind of pelvic bone, you're a woman. And so they got a kind of a curious approximation of what was real, but it was only an approximation. They didn't have the dynamic way. So at the Greek phrase, when you use the Greek term for being, it's not like the Latin term that comes out, which later on becomes this big philosophical conundrum. What is being? The Greek phrase has a poetic quality of equilibrium. Ton on ton. Almost like a palindrome in syllables. Ton on ton. Comes from the esoteric Greek, which is based upon the esoteric Egyptian. In Egyptian, ancient Egyptian, in the hieroglyphic language, when you would pronounce what turns out to be being, you would say nt, or sometimes spelled out like in Wallace Budge's natur. And what it looks like in hieroglyph is like a little axe head or like a little pennant. And it was the hieroglyph, the sacred glyph. It was the way to express that being is dynamic. It's a dynamic gestalt. And the Greek phrase for being is dynamic. The ing counts. Being. It's happening. Not being as in a being. Ton on ton. And so from this, we get the English words that have on ton, ontology. Or derivatives, gerontology. We get those kinds of words. But the English that is used is habituated by medieval Latin to such extent that the English is misleading. Totally misleading. And that kind of English language throws itself, whenever it comes into conundrums, back upon its Old English roots, which are very close to German, and the way that the German language bridges over the gap of these fixed vertebrae, syllabic ideas, is to put hyphens. Little tinker toy connectors. Well, these words go together with a hyphen. Welt. Height. Kind. And so you have all these hyphens. And when you get through, you're breathless trying to say something that is really dynamic. You've got like a DNA code with all these hyphens. And so you have to have doctrines and principles and the whole thing just to get straight and keep ordered the hyphenated designations. And to make them more usable, you just use the first letter of the first major word, so you come out with these kind of initialed anagram statements that are just lard for the mind. Absolute lard. So nobody can think. It's a deadly process. Especially because when you integrate this, all you do is you boil down this whole confusion into a knot. And that knot then becomes the projective fount. It becomes the structure, the form without content for that personality. So when the psychiatrist comes to deal with that personality, he also or she also is one of these knots. It's a thankless process. There's almost no way out of that anything real can come. The only thing that can happen that halfway works is an agreed upon consensus that this approximation at least will get us through the day. The truth is that's nothing. It's nothing at all. So when we come to our education now in vision, there are so many complex realities that we can't talk about at all. But they're worked with in such a way that they're all folded into what's going on. And so your key is just simply to participate in what's going on, not in follow the leader, but just let it happen long enough till you get the feel of it. And the gestalts are there, and the language is used in such a way that it opens out for your inspection more and more. As you get used to it more and more, you begin to be able to consider it, not in any kind of hypnotic way, not in any kind of compulsive way, but as a formal structure of indication of a pattern which you can test and check and modify for yourself. Emphasis on modification. Not just to see whether it's true or false, but in order to modify it to your own deal, your own way of living. A short form of this is that consciousness is the beginning. Vision is the beginning of consciousness. And so the whole second year deals with consciousness. Vision is the differential of realization. And the basic principle is like a rule of thumb. It's very simple. If you enrich integration, then you improve differentiation. So we're constantly now, in the second year, looping back into the first year, into the ecology, the cycle of the first year, and utilizing it, utilizing portions of it, or stylizing the whole of it in different ways all the time. And as we do this, we become more and more acquainted with the facility that's there for its multidimensional usefulness. And that's why all of the various elements that have been developed, your projects, you made masks in ritual, your concerns with mythic images. Some of you investigated Aphrodite. Some of you investigated Athena. All of these various projects now have many facets to them. And the more that we use these experiences, the more facets there are. But we're engendering new projects with a consciousness looking forward to doing new projects in such a way that they will have facility for being multidimensional for us later on this year. The first project, the very first project, is that we have a very complicated book coming up, a book by Carl Jung called Alchemical Studies. Alchemy deals with distillation, it deals with transformation. And Jung's book has 5 very difficult essays in it about this whole process of distillation, of transformation. Our first project is for you to make little hunting groups of 2 or 3 people tackling each of these 5 sections of this book so that when we use it a couple of months from now, these various little hunting groups will do the teaching of that various section. Because the way that I'm going to present it is a way that would be a little difficult to go into detail. Because I'm going to present it strategically. But you need also the technical detail, not big spiel, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And so these groups of 2 or 3 people on each of these sections of this book will come in just like a project, just like the other projects, and just share with what they made out of it. It doesn't have to be accurate. It doesn't have to be complete. What did you make out of it? Because your audience is on the same level as your capacity. You're speaking to people who are not experts in archetypal transcendental psychology. They're people just like you. So at whatever level you have time enough and capacity enough to speak, your audience also has just enough time and just enough capacity to hear. And so you will find a natural, it's like water seeking a natural level. You have a natural way to establish just the right practical level to hear that information. And whereas I'm speaking, at that time I'll be speaking like jet stream stuff. This would be like the smell of the fields, the feel of the ground. And those 2 aspects together will be useful for you. Because with those 2 aspects, you'll be able to have some kind of a gestalt that's halfway workable for our next projects. And our next projects are in art. And our next projects in art, one of them is going to be very encouraging, and the other is going to be very discouraging. Because there's always a pair, right? There's always something going on like that. The discouraging project is going to be to make a piece of sculpture. Now, it's not discouraging to make a piece of sculpture, but the use of that piece of sculpture is that you bring that sculpture in and you show it, and then you give it to someone else and they get to change it. They get to modify it according to what they want it to be. And that's excruciating for you to bring in a sculpture, maybe the first time in your whole life you made a sculpture, look at that. And then you have to give it to somebody who's going to change it. To destroy my work. No, there have been fights. Believe me. I keep a club on those days. Back! You know. But what's really great is that you have to have some way to balance out. I mean, that's a terrible insult. So you have to have vengeance built in. They have to give their changes on your sculpture to a third person, and they get to change that. So you get to see, well, how do you like it, huh? Yeah, you sabotage my work? Look at that. How about that? Look what they did to it. So that's the discouraging art project. Everybody's going to make a sculpture and bring it in at the end of the first month. Then have to give it to somebody who's going to make a change, and at the end of the second month they'll bring in their changes, and then they have to give it to a third person, and at the end of the third month they bring in their changes. And so we'll see 2 orders of permutation on a personal expression and all the attendant feelings and words. Words come out of this. The encouraging project is to make a painting. Everyone's going to make a painting. While all this is happening, while they're wrecking your work, you get to express yourself in a painting. Now, some of these paintings are very interesting. They do not have to be Rembrandt. They don't even have to be Picasso. They have to be just you, whatever it is. So we're going to make sculptures and paintings. But in order to get there, in order to get to art, we need to get the juices going in such a way that there will be juice enough for you to do these things. That's what this assignment with Jung's alchemical studies is. Because there's a certain amount of frustration involved. Because Jung's language is tantalizing in the sense that we're all convinced that he knows what he's talking about, and he's talking about something really important, and we can't quite get to it. Excuse me, but part of this is because Jung didn't quite get to it either. One of the great formative works in alchemical studies, one of the sections is on the secret of the golden flower, which he did the introduction to the German translation of The Secret of the Golden Flower by Richard Wilhelm. And Jung's introduction to The Secret of the Golden Flower is one of the sections of the alchemical studies. And Jung completely misunderstands Taoism. But he misunderstands Taoism in such a way that even the later Chinese misunderstood it in exactly that way. So that Jung's misunderstanding turns out to be very characteristic of 18th and 19th century Chinese, so-called Taoists, who were not really Taoists at all, but were not Taoists in just the same way that Jung was not a Taoist. And so he's very accurate about 18th, 19th century Chinese pseudo-Taoism, but has nothing to do with actual Taoism. Nothing whatsoever. And so it'll be very interesting. You don't have to know about Taoism. You don't even have to know about Jung's misassessment of Taoism. Your misassessment of his misassessment, in a way, is just the right level of illusion for us to see through. And that's all that we need. Because the whole purpose of this is to show that vision is highly dynamic, highly mobile, and is able to be changed very easily, very quickly. One of the great things about consciousness is its total malleability. Because consciousness is not founded upon content, but is a function of form. And as long as the form is active, it's happy. And the only governor that we need to keep this thing of getting out of control is to realize that we can't go hog wild and have just any kind of content. That it has to have some kind of, the word is rationale. Rationale. It means a structure that has ratioed proportion that holds together. And we will see that consciousness is a structure of ratioed proportion. In the Renaissance, they had the same name for it that the Chinese had in the Tang Dynasty. It translates as the golden mean. And as long as the golden mean is active, consciousness is really precise and happy. Very happy. And it gets unhappy when the proportioned ratios get out of sync. Then it starts to sabotage the works. Then you become your own worst enemy. Notice here that there is a built-in gracefulness to consciousness, but also at the same time that built-in gracefulness is a peril. The gracefulness is that your consciousness is never going to let you get too far away from what you can sustain by your own life. The peril is that what you think is sustaining your life is maybe totally off from flawed premises and fundamentals that somebody gave you, and they didn't even know it was flawed, and you just accepted it. That's how the phrase "my God" got into the English language. Fortunately, consciousness is faster than the habit patterns. A good magician, legerdemain, knows that the hand is faster than the eye. The mind is much faster than the hand. And consciousness is ever so much faster than the mind. That's why its symbol in alchemy was quicksilver. The trickster. It is so fast that it can be at both logical oppositions at the very same time, seemingly. And as long as we have some way to go back and check the folds, are we operating with a ritual comportment that is in harmony with nature? When we make that determination, then we know that whatever else is going on, we have a fighting chance to be quite realistic. As long as our ritual comportment has an alignment with nature, we have every chance of being effective, quote, successful, quote, happy. And consciousness can make all the other adjustments. Why? Because it indexes experience and essence. Consciousness indexes the mind just like the mind indexes the body. Just like blood is indexed by neuroplasma, spirit indexes neuroplasma, psychic energy. And those love alignment. And part of the feeling tone of certainty is when those fluids are aligned. It's just like the middle ear. When the fluid of the middle ear is in equilibrium, and you can get so good at this that you could tightrope walk across the Grand Canyon on a thread. Our ability to detect accurately equilibrium is fabulous. This is why neurotics are so unhappy, because they're highly sensitized people and they know it's wrong. And it's always wrong, and that's why they're like they are. In an odd, converse way, somebody who's really together is incredibly together. And they know it, they feel it. Not only do they feel it, the animals feel it, the children feel it, the land feels it, the whole forest hums with you. Wow. Is in early Taoism, it has something to do with man and nature. That when the human being is in alignment like that, you step into this magical realm where all that resonates is consonant with your resonance. The ancient Chinese word for that was pronounced Shen. Shen means a spirit being. Shen is eternal. Can go over wherever it wants to go, whatever dimension. For us, what it means is like someone like Thoreau able to stand with the trees in a snowstorm, because nobody had ever done that. And he felt the need for companionship. And what the forest said to him, after he had that experience of standing through a whole snowstorm with them, the trees said to him, you need to come out here with us for a while and live with us for a while in order to make an accurate estimate of what you really need in order to live. And it was that incident that was the trigger for his whole experience at Walden. Walden was Thoreau's American Indian vision quest to find out what he really needed to live with. So he went to the nearest equivalent of God in Concord. He went to Ralph Waldo Emerson, who owned the land around Walden Pond, and he said, yeah, of course you can go there. Are you going to stand? No, I'm going to build a cabin. All right, you can cut some trees down and make a cabin. And Walden, then, the book Walden, is an artistic expression of that experiment in realization. And when one reads Walden, one comes to see that Thoreau is incredibly accurate. What he wants to know is, what is the exact bare minimum that I need to live as a conscientious man so that I stay within myself? Because once I've established that, then I know that anything below that is going to be subhuman level. And anything on top of that is going to be gravy. And while I'd like to have some gravy, I know that this is the waterline level at which I am real in my own life. Now, once a human being knows that, they are free. Once you know the waterline of what you need to be real in your own life, once you know that line, that's a baseline that extends forever. Because once freed, here, you are freed anywhere that you are. Any life, any dimension, any level. That's how this universe works. Thoreau took the manuscript of Walden to New York City. He took it with him to a hotel room where he had a meeting with Walt Whitman. Whitman had written the first edition of Leaves of Grass. And Whitman had thought, like the young Whitman was, that he'd really done it. And then he was talking to Thoreau, and his eyes became very wide, and he realized that he'd missed the huge resonances, the cosmic resonances. And so he went back and redid Leaves of Grass. And when you compare the edition of Leaves of Grass that came out a few years later with the first edition, I mean, it's like looking at a boulder and then looking at the planet. Leaves of Grass all of a sudden has incredible capacity to be a universal being. And Whitman says in Leaves of Grass, do I contradict myself? There, it's fine. Let me contradict myself. I feel like that today. And in between Thoreau and Whitman, in between Walden with its log cabin fundamental freedom line and Whitman's cosmic person, in between those two was the talented man Abraham Lincoln, who knew exactly what living in a log cabin on a reality line was, and knew exactly that in order to get to that cosmic man, you have to have a working prism called a unity. And he found himself in a position where he could do something about it. And he said, this country is a functioning, civilized unity that men and women can use to determine that reality line in their own lives and aspire to the cosmic person that they would like to be. And it's in my hands, and no one's going to take it away. And largely because that's real, we got to where we are. Because without people like that, we wouldn't be here in this form today. Now, just because it's been trashed and forgotten and sloshed over for a couple of generations doesn't obviate the reality that that really happened and really was there and really is still here, like the folds in the page. The United States still has pageness. and we get a real education so that there are real people able to put their speech on that pageness, that prism will be there and it'll work.